And while we're in the meditative mode, let's just for a few minutes now, we'll shift our attention from the breath to a kind of contemplative meditation on compassion, or on bodhicitta, our motivation, uh, compassion and loving kindness as our motivation, for life, for this series of classes, for this particular class. Uh, we could begin with some recognition right there. First of all, everyone can actually just remind ourselves so that everybody's exactly the same in wanting to be happy and not wanting to suffer. That's true of, we can each think that's true of myself, it's true of my friends and family, it's equally true of enemies, of people I don't like, of strangers, of everyone I don't know, not just of humans, but of animals, right? That we're all the same. If you watch even like animals outside, right, or pets, they're the same also. They don't want to suffer, they want to be happy. And even my enemies or people I don't like, it seems like actually they want to be happy just as much as I do. Just like me, I want to be happy, but sometimes I do things that cause myself and others suffering. And they're the same, right? They want to be happy. Sometimes they do things that cause themselves and others suffering. So we're the same in that way. Actually, everybody's the same in that way. And then also we're all interdependent. Oh, if I try to just make myself happy in the absence of considering others' well-being, it actually doesn't work. Whether you think from like an environmental level, we're all interdependent. Economic level, we're all interdependent. In terms of like on a social level, actually everything, right? All the food I have, all um, this, the computer and the internet service, water, right? My home, everything is interdependent with the welfare of others. None of it came about only through me. So my well-being and the well-being of others are totally interrelated and interdependent. So to take care of others, I have to take care of myself. To take care of myself, I have to take care of others. When I focus exclusively on my own well-being, first of all, it's unrealistic. And secondly, it makes anybody, right, anxious, uneasy, and extreme, even like it's like kind of a paranoid state, actually. When I open my heart and recognize my interdependence with others, I start to recognize that it's through loving kindness and compassion that I have some success in bringing others happiness and also myself happiness. So now we're connecting, right? So our purpose today is just that, right? Loving kindness and compassion for ourselves and for others. And in that way, that when we're in touch with that, then we can also recognize there's so much suffering in the world. Right? We ourselves suffer, others suffer. And actually, the suffering of others is really inconceivable. Whether it's the suffering of people, again, hospitals who can't have visitors come because of the coronavirus, whether it's just reading about the suffering of like millions of people who are now suffering from hunger, in danger of starvation. And all the ordinary suffering. Of grief, of loss, of illness, and so if we're in touch with our compassion, right, wishing to free others and ourselves from suffering, we feel, so I have to become enlightened, I have to progress in wisdom in order to be of benefit to others. So that's the purpose then, right, of studying the Perfection of Wisdom Sutra. So in all our, ideas in all our spiritual efforts, purpose is compassion and love. And in particular, as we study a topic like wisdom, the purpose is to become more wise, to gradually become enlightened, in order to be more effective in being of service to others, in easing the suffering of the world, and leading others to enlightenment and liberation from suffering. As well as the Dalai Lama often points out, like things like, making ourselves peaceful is the first step in our contributing to world peace. And then there's this recognition, in Buddhism particularly, there's emphasis on how ignorance is the cause of suffering. Suffering comes about, the main factor, or like the primary cause of suffering is ignorance. So if we want to express our compassion, then first step is to try to ourselves become a little bit, each of us, striving to become more wise, and then to embody that for others. Because wisdom is the antidote to ignorance. Okay, so that was just to remind us of our motivation. And then actually, with that motivation, I'll just do. Usually, we do the. We were in previous classes. We were doing this. We can do that. Just briefly, there's like you don't have to say if you don't want, but there's a verse of refuge and bodhicitta. So if you want to, I'll say it. If you want to join in, you can. But I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. And then, so then we're gonna study the Heart Sutra, right, which is a teaching, from the time of the Buddha himself, which we'll get into, is given in India. And maybe I'll say something first, and then we'll read the Heart Sutra once too. It's a very short sutra, but maybe before we read it, I'll just say there's like preliminary comments, and then we'll get into the actual. One thing, actually, for those who have attended teachings by His Holiness Dalai Lama, oftentimes the Heart Sutra will be recited at the beginning. And then, some decades ago, His Holiness Dalai Lama started a tradition where he would have, at the beginning, I think when he was first teaching in the world, in the West, or after he left Tibet, the Tibetans would chant it in Tibetan. But then the Dalai Lama had noted that the Heart Sutra in particular is so popular, so well known throughout all different countries where Buddhism spread, that he started having asking attendees from different cultures to recite it. And so if you've attended, it's quite beautiful where, on different days you'll see they'll actually be there and it'll be recited, one day in Chinese, and the next day in Japanese, next day in Korean, next day in, Vietnamese, and Mongolian. And last decade or so, they started to add English and sometimes, French or Russian or other languages. And also Sanskrit, the original language that it was, recorded in. It'll be chanted in Sanskrit as well by people, scholars from India. And I guess part of my point is that it's a very ancient teaching of the Buddha that really, interestingly, kind of became very well known throughout every place Buddhism spread on the planet. And then if you think about, actually I sometimes think that, if you think about the world population, then it was one of the most popular and well-known spiritual teachings on the planet, right? Because China is a very populated country, and Korea and so on. So, it's been very widespread, this sutra. And it's often used in various different ways in different cultures, but the Buddha, as you'll see, kind of was present when it was taught, and it was a teaching on wisdom, right? But then, so it's used for that purpose throughout the Buddhist world. Actually, I was reading recently, I was going to actually share this, like a lot of like Gyube Khyentse Rinpoche, who sometimes teaches at our center, and Lama Zopa Rinpoche, who's the spiritual director of the center, and Lama Yeshe, who founded FPMT, the organization the center is part of. They all studied at Sera Monastery. And I was recently reading a book that was describing what the monks at Sera would do in Tibet. One point was, it said in Tibet, they would recite the Heart Sutra 9 times, before they're early in the day together. And they said in India, they only recite it 3 times because it's hot. They don't want to have to sit as long in southern India. but that gives some indication of like the importance of this sutra, right? That the monks at Sera would recite it every single day, you know, 9 times in Tibet. So, and it's odd, it's kind of funny, right? Because like, you know, Tibet is very distant from, say, Japan, right? Very, very far away, right? Tibetans and Japanese have very little contact. But you know, in Japan, it was also recited often by the Zen monks, right? And they would, if you've heard it, they'll hit this wooden thing, right? Very, very beautiful chanting that they do. You know, and then like, yeah, in Mongolia. So anyway, it's recited oftentimes in many different places. Uh, then also, I guess I'll just say briefly, I don't want to get too far into this, but so the Heart Sutra, I was saying, so it's often recited, the main purpose of it is to cultivate wisdom. Right? Then if you actually spend time with Tibetans, you'll see in Tibetan culture, there are other, like, and I guess in other cultures, apparently there were other uses of it. Like, so it would also be recited if they felt there was obstacle, if there was some sense of like there were obstacles for the community or for an individual, and they would recite the Heart Sutra or the Prajnaparamita Sutras to remove obstacles. And then there's even a tradition that they would recite it if they thought there were like evil spirits or something, and they would recite the sutra. But then I remember the story. I was trying to find the source for it. I couldn't find it yesterday, but I'll just share it. It made me laugh one time when I read it, because there was a story, like, which I think gets at the important point. Tibetans, of course, think about things like that, obstacles and spirits. But anyway, there was a story in Tibet where, like, actually it was like a lama, sort of dressed funny, and he would, like, people were afraid of him, so they were, and he did this on purpose. So they were reciting the Heart Sutra, to, like, trying to remove the obstacle of his presence. But there's a line in that. Not in the Heart Sutra itself, but in the ritual, where it says, through our reading and our understanding of this. And then he pointed out, well, you don't understand it, so it's not going to work. Point being that, you know, rituals by themselves are not the point. The point is to understand it. And so that's why it's quite good if that we'll study it together. You know, the point is to understand the meaning. So it's not just to recite it for ritual purposes, but to understand the deep meaning of this sutra, which is not easy, because it's a complicated, you know, it's teaching on wisdom, on the wisdom of emptiness. And I often share this too. I often think about this. There's a famous, I'm not going to quote it, but I'll paraphrase. There's a famous point, the famous Sakya Lama, Sakya Pandita, who was a teacher. He was a great Tibetan Lama who then became teacher of the Emperor of China. But he often said about wisdom, we're talking about wisdom, right? The Perfection of Wisdom Sutra. And he said, he made this point, he said something like this: if you want to be wise, then you can't, you're not also going to always be able to be always comfortable, right? Because wisdom is not easy to gain. And it comes about through work, through effort, through difficult experience sometimes. And wisdom is different than knowledge, isn't it? You know, we can know something, like the words of something. Actually, I'll share this too. This is one of my favorite Buddhist stories. But Naropa, who's a great Indian Buddhist master, right? He was like they said he was like one of the, like, almost like, I don't know, they call it doorkeeper, but it would be like a dean, one of the deans of Nalanda Monastic University, which was the greatest university on the planet at the time. So he was like one of the deans there. And he was very famous as being a great scholar, right? And then one day he was outside, he was sitting like under a tree somewhere outside, I think, reciting and reading some sutras, actually. And then this, the text, his biography describes, it says, an old woman with 37 different features of ugliness appeared. She was quite hideous looking. And she said to him, "Do you understand the words or the meaning of what you're reciting?" And he said, "Well, of course I understand the words." And before he could finish his sentence, she started dancing around and said, "Oh, that's great. You're a great scholar. You told the truth. You understand the words." And then he said, "But I also understand the deep meaning." And then she started crying. And he said, "Why are you crying?" And she said, "You know, because you, who are a monk and a spiritual practitioner, lied. You understand the words, but you don't know anything about the meaning." And he looked at her and he said, "Well, then who understands the meaning?" And she said, basically, she said, "I do, my brother does, but you don't." And he realized she was right. In other words, that he had knowledge, but not wisdom. They say he left the monastery then and went in search of wisdom. Then he became one of the great masters of his time. The point being, I'm just using that as an example, right? But the point being, that wisdom doesn't come about only through, it comes about through difficult intellectual work, difficult personal work, difficult introspection, through analyzing our own experience. And not, so, we can't let the words be out there and the meaning, we have to integrate them into our being, right? Through contemplation, through practice, through life, through trying to live in a way that's congruent with what we're studying. Anyway, so that's part of the process of gaining wisdom that Sakya Pandita was pointing out. But anyway, all of that said, what I'm thinking we could do then is I'm going to try to put it up on the screen. First of all, actually, maybe I'll say this too for people who are going to be, it's an ongoing series of classes, right? So, there are many different commentaries to the Heart Sutra, but for the purposes of this class, one thing is the Heart Sutra itself, which I've got a copy of here. I'm going to try to see if I can put it up on the screen in a second. And then a commentary by Tendar Larampa, who is a Tibetan teacher from the 1800s. We're going to use that as like the main commentary to follow along. I'll supplement it with materials from other commentaries. So those are on the website is one point. So if you want to, you can print it out for yourself. You can download it and read those. So they're available for free on the center's website. You can just, they're on the page about this class. But let me see, and what I wanted to suggest we do is just, I don't want to do this every class. Like in Tibet, of course, they would all recite it 9 times before they would study. But one day I was talking to Khensa Rinpoche and I said, well, should we do like a lot of rituals like that before I was talking to him. And I said, like, do you think it's useful to do a lot of rituals like that before we have class? And then he said, for us Tibetan monks, it's quite good to do that because that's all we do. We're there, we're studying and doing spiritual practice all day and all night. So it's wonderful. He said, for you people, you're very busy. And then he said, so if you do the ritual, then there's no time to study and contemplate. So he said, don't spend too much time on rituals, which I thought made quite good sense. He's always very reasonable. But I thought since this is the first class in this series, maybe it would be good to recite it once. So I'm going to try, okay, I'm going to go ahead and try to put it up. And then I guess I can't hear you guys, but I'll read it through once, read along if you want. And that way it just sort of familiarizes us with the actual text. So let's see if this works. Heart Sutra. You are screen sharing. Okay, I guess, can people see it? Great, okay. So yeah, we'll read it through once. Well, I'll read it through one time. So, the Heart of the Perfection of Wisdom Sutra, Arya Bhagavati Prajna Paramita Hridaya Sutra. Thus did I hear at one time. The Bhagavan was dwelling on Mass of Vultures Mountain in Rajgriha, together with a great community of monks and a great community of bodhisattvas. At that time, the Bhagavan was absorbed in the concentration on the categories of phenomena called profound perception. Also at that time, the Bodhisattva, the Mahasattva, Arya Avalokiteshvara, looked upon the very practice of the profound perfection of wisdom and beheld those 5 aggregates also as empty of inherent nature. Then, through the power of Buddha, the Venerable Shariputra said this to the Bodhisattva, Mahasattva Arya Avalokiteshvara. How should any son of the lineage train who wishes to practice the activity of the profound perfection of wisdom? He said that, and the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Avalokiteshvara said this to the Venerable Sharadvatiputra. Shariputra, any son of the lineage or daughter of the lineage who wishes to practice the activity of the profound perfection of wisdom should look upon it like this, correctly and repeatedly beholding those 5 aggregates also as empty of inherent nature. Form is empty. Emptiness is form. Emptiness is not other than form. Form is also not other than emptiness. In the same way, feeling, discrimination, compositional factors, and consciousness are empty. Shariputra, likewise, all phenomena are emptiness, without characteristic, unproduced, unceased, stainless, not without stain, not deficient, not fulfilled. Shariputra, therefore, in emptiness, there is no form, no feeling, no discrimination, no compositional factors, no consciousness, no eye, no ear, no nose, no tongue, no body, no mind, no visual form, no sound, no odor, no taste, no object of touch, and no phenomenon. There is no I element, and so on, up to including no mind element and no mental consciousness element. There is no ignorance, no extinction of ignorance, and so on, up to and including no aging and death, and no extinction of aging and death. Similarly, there is no suffering, origination, cessation, and path. There is no exalted wisdom, no attainment, and also no non-attainment. Shariputra, therefore, because there is no attainment, Bodhisattvas rely on and dwell in the perfection of wisdom, the mind without obstruction and without fear. Having completely passed beyond error, they reach the end point of nirvana. All the Buddhas who dwell in the three times also manifestly and completely awaken to unsurpassable, perfect, and complete enlightenment in reliance upon the perfection of wisdom. Therefore, the mantra of the perfection of wisdom, the mantra of great knowledge, the unsurpassed mantra, the mantra equal to the unequaled, the mantra that thoroughly pacifies all suffering, should be known as the truth, since it is not false. The mantra of the perfection of wisdom is declared. Tayata om gate gate paragate parasamgate bodhisoha. Shariputra, the Bodhisattva, the Mahasattva, should train in the profound perfection of wisdom like that. Then the Bhagavan arose from that concentration and commended the Bodhisattva, Mahasattva, Arya Avalokiteshvara, saying, well said, son of lineage, it is like that. It is like that. One should practice the profound perfection of wisdom just as you have indicated. Even the Tathagatas rejoice. The Bhagavan having thus spoken, the Venerable Sharadvatiputra, the Bodhisattva, Mahasattva, Arya Avalokiteshvara, those surrounding in the entirety along with the worlds of gods, humans, asuras, and gandharvas were overjoyed and highly praised that spoken by the Bhagavan. Okay, I'll stop the share. All right, well, so that's one through of that. So over the series of these classes, what we'll do is we'll go through, really kind of word by word, the meaning of the sutra and sort of contemplate it together a bit. But then I thought, so today I want to at least cover, the title. And maybe cover a little bit of Tendar Larampa's commentary. Just made me laugh when I said cover the title, because I remember one time I was, actually many times things like this have happened, but sometimes I would attend a teaching by Lama Zopa Rinpoche, one of my teachers, the Fed Lama, right, Lama Zopa Rinpoche. And then he would teach a text like this, some text like this. And then oftentimes we would go for like, say, a 4-day weekend. And on like the 4th day, he would say, well, I've been covering the first word for the first 3 days. And then he would say, so I guess I'm not going to finish the text, which was kind of funny. But anyway, we have time, so we don't have to rush through the whole text. But first, I wanted to actually just put this text a little bit in context for a moment. So one point is it's part of a collection of texts, you could call it. Sometimes they say there are 17 or so texts in Tibetan that are part of what are called the Prajna Paramita literature, right? Perfection of Prajna. So Prajna Paramita, briefly, we're going to go into detail about those words, but in brief means perfection of wisdom, is how it's usually translated. And so one point, so maybe I'll say that sometimes in Indian and Tibetan tradition, they talk about 3 turnings of the, actually in other traditions too, they talk about 3 turnings of the wheel of Dharma. So it's like 3 sets of teachings given by the Buddha, right, historically. And so I just thought to briefly mention those 3 turnings of the wheel, because that gives a context for the heart, where does the Heart Sutra fit in that. And so we say the first turning of the wheel of Dharma was given it was given in Deer Park, right? It began in Deer Park, you could say. Which is near Sarnath in Varanasi, India. That was the first turning of the wheel. So it came after, most of you I'm sure know the story, right? But the Buddha achieved enlightenment, right, in Bodh Gaya, and then they say he hesitated at first to teach, right? He thought, what I realized is so profound. Will anybody even appreciate it? Can others understand it, right? So he hesitated a bit. And he then they say actually that Brahma came and offered him a golden wheel and said, please turn the wheel of Dharma, right? And so he went to the deer park, near Varanasi, and he taught what they call the first turning of the wheel of Dharma, which is the teaching of the Four Noble Truths, right? Which was the core teaching, fundamental teaching of Buddhism. And that includes like also the 12 links of dependent origination, the 3 higher trainings. So there are many different teachings, the 37 factors conducive to enlightenment. But we ordinarily call that the first turning of the wheel of Dharma, which is the Four Noble Truths, and all those others can be understood in the context of the Four Noble Truths. Right, and you guys know, right, the truth of suffering, the truth of the origination of suffering, the truth of the cessation of suffering, and the truth of the path to that cessation. So that was the first set of teachings by the Buddha. And in that set of teachings, the Buddha taught, sometimes we call it anatman, right? Like, so it means no self, selflessness, which was totally radical teaching, right? Actually, oftentimes, Dalai Lama points this out, that like, if you look in the world, there are many points that Buddhism and other religious traditions have in common. But the one thing that's totally unique to Buddhism is it's the only tradition that teaches no self. It's a unique tenet of Buddhism. So anyway, that was a, kind of a radical teaching. So then later in actually, as the sutra says, we just read it, right? At a place called Mass Vultures Mountain in Rajagriha, Rajagriha, which is near Bodh Gaya, actually. The Buddha taught the second turning of the wheel of Dharma. And that second turning of the wheel of Dharma is the Prajnaparamita, mainly. It's the teaching of emptiness, which is in many ways more radical, actually is more radical philosophically and experientially than even than Anatman. And what they say actually was that the Buddha taught the Prajnaparamita sutras there on that mountain, but recognized that, what's the say, right? That in general, most people were not ready to hear that teaching, that it was too radical. And so the Buddha asked that it be kept secret or hidden for a few hundred years. So it was kind of kept as an oral hidden tradition, for a period of time until around the time of Nagarjuna, which was around, people debate Nagarjuna's dates, but it was about, 400 or 500 years later, roughly. And that's when, at the time of Nagarjuna, the teachings of the Prajnaparamita became more well known in the world and have been ever since, right? That's so all those, and that's where actually it's interesting. Nagarjuna, right, who was great, one of the most respected in Mahayana Indian Buddhist masters, probably the most respected other than the Buddha himself. The Tibetan traditions trace their lineages back to Nagarjuna, but so do the Chan lineages of China, the Zen lineages of Japan, the Zen lineages of Korea and Vietnam. Anyway, they all trace their lineages back to Nagarjuna, who wrote commentaries on the Prajnaparamita. That's the second turning of the wheel of Dharma would be the Prajnaparamita sutras are the main sutras, and they teach the radical view of emptiness. Then the third turning of the wheel of Dharma came again later, and the main teaching of this turning of the wheel of Dharma would be like there are not many scriptures, but one is the Tathagarbha Sutra and the Samadhi Nirmochana Sutra, the sutra unraveling the thought of the Buddha. And those teachings emphasize Buddha nature, teachings on Buddha nature. And by the way, so the second turning of the wheel of Dharma is considered definitive by and is emphasized by the middle way school, the Madhyamakas, the middle way school. The third turning of the wheel of Dharma is particularly emphasized by and sort of, and relied upon by the mind-only school. And we sometimes say, so then I want to share another reflection. So then afterwards, like different teachers have written, Buddhist teachers that throughout the centuries have written texts, right, saying, well, which are definitive? Does that make sense? Like the Buddha taught all these different, three different turnings of the wheel and many different teachings. And in some cases, on the surface, those teachings seem, it's hard to see how they're in harmony. Does that make sense? It's hard to see how they teach the same point. And so teachers will have written texts on which are definitive and which are to be interpreted. And I'll give an example of what I mean by that. In the teaching on the Four Noble Truths, right, in that turning of the wheel of Dharma, the Buddha taught that there is no permanent, unitary, independent self, right? That's anatman, right? But he didn't say what he said in the Heart Sutra, right? He wouldn't say there's no eyes, no ears, no nose, no tongue. He felt that would frighten people, that they would think, that they would become nihilists. It's not a nihilistic teaching. We're going to get into that. He's not teaching nihilism there, but he recognized that those disciples, if you were to say something that radical, right, like I just read, that those disciples would not understand it and would become nihilists. Whereas then in the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, right, he says, no phenomena, right? So he gives this kind of extreme sense that everything is empty of intrinsic existence. Does that make sense? So it's a different, on the surface, that looks quite different, doesn't it? Then in the mind only, the mind only school's interpretation of the third turning of the wheel of Dharma, they say, they would say, well, when it says there are no external objects, that's true, but mind is real. That's what they would say. Right? They would say, mind has some kind of intrinsic existence. And so my point is that there are different teachings in Buddhism, right? And then different Buddhist masters have, said, well, you have to understand. And so what's the criteria for understanding which are definitive and which are to be interpreted? And one point, actually, which I think is great, is the criteria can't be quoting scripture, right? Because they're all scriptures. So if you say, well, I'm quoting this scripture, it says that this is true, and somebody else says, well, I'm quoting this scripture, it says that's true. That can't be the definitive way to interpret or way to differentiate, because if the scriptures say different things, then they're both, in that sense, they're equally valid in the sense that if you say, well, they were taught by the Buddha, for example, because they were. And so this is a wonderful point about Buddhism, is that the differentiating point should be reason. It should be logic. It should be direct experience. Experience, and then logic and reason. All the Tibetan schools, I'll say it this way, all the Tibetan, so the four, there are four main now still existing Tibetan schools of Buddhism. There are other schools that went out of existence or they're smaller, but all those schools agree, their positions are all the same, which is that the second turning of the wheel of Dharma, the Prajnaparamita Sutras, of which the Heart Sutra is one, is the definitive teaching of the Buddha. That when you apply logic and reasoning, it's those teachings. It's those teachings on emptiness of intrinsic nature are the ultimate teaching of the Buddha. They're the ultimate intent. That all the other teachings of the Buddha are to lead one to that. That they're also valid. And actually, it's an interesting point. In Buddhism, there's one thing which is there are two types in a way of what it means when we say valid. One is what's the ultimate intent? What's the ultimate meaning? And that there has to be one. Does that make sense? When you analyze through logic and reasoning, you say, well, what's the final definitive meaning of the Buddha's teachings? It's what's taught in the Prajnaparamita. That's what Lama Tsongkhapa, the founder of the Gelugpa tradition, says, but it's also what, so also the position of the great masters of the Nyingma and Kagyu and Sakya schools too. But then I want to point something out, and this is one thing I think is quite, wonderful. Personally, I've always thought that about Buddhism, is that, so that's the sort of logical, final, and experiential final point of the Buddha's teachings. But then, for any given practitioner, for any given person, what's most useful is a different question. Does that make sense? And so at a given point, so for example, let's see this right. Actually, his Holiness Dalai Lama points this out. This is part of his Holiness Dalai Lama often emphasizes this in terms of why all different religious traditions have their own validity and serve a function, right? And he makes this point. He says, like, if for one given person, you know, their way of coming to compassion, for example, is to feel everyone is a child of the same God who created everyone, right? If for one person who, let's say, a practitioner of Judaism or Christianity or Islam, if they were to think that way, and then that were to make them feel, well, all of us are children of the same creator, so I have compassion and love for everyone because we're all one family, then for that person, that's an effective method. And that's a correct method. Does that make sense? From a Buddhist perspective, we would say, well, there's not one single, ultimately, if you analyze it logically and through reasoning and through, then we would say, well, that there's one single creator is not a tenable position. It's not actually literally true. But that doesn't matter. It's what's useful for that person at that point, right? So from one perspective, you have to say what's useful for the given person. And so, for example, the teaching on the Four Noble Truths, even for us, it's actually even for one point, so that's one point. But then within Buddhism even, right? At different moments, for different people, different teachings are most useful. You know, and I'll give an example. Like, even if you know the teaching on no nature or no inherent existence, right? If you're really angry at somebody and you want to punch them or hit them or scream at them, you may not be able to meditate on that teaching, right? But if you think about the first turning the wheel of Dharma and the teaching on karma, and if you think, well, if I punch them, it's creating bad karma, and that stops you from punching them, then that's the right teaching for that moment. Does that make sense? And even if you say, well, you know, is that the ultimate nature of all phenomena? No, but the teachings on karma are valid conventionally, and they're the right teaching for a moment where you want to scream at somebody because you're mad at them. If you're somebody who's realized emptiness directly and can meditate on it in that moment, then that's great. Then you know, realized it deeply and you can, but we have to know for ourselves what, you know, and for example, the teaching on Buddha nature, right? Like, I remember, I'll just share this story. I remember, like, sometimes I would be talking to so Lama Tsongkhapa's position is that Buddha nature exists and it's emptiness, right? But then there are some scriptures in Buddhism that say you're already a Buddha. Now, Lama Tsongkhapa says, well, Buddha means omniscient. How can you be a Buddha and not know it? You know, like, you're a Buddha, but you don't know it. Then he said, Lama Tsongkhapa says, that's not a tenable position logically, right? The term Buddha knows everything and is wise. How can you be a Buddha who doesn't know they're a Buddha? But there are some scriptures that say that. So that's not a definitive scripture, right? But for example, if I have a friend who says I was feeling really discouraged in my spiritual practice, and then I read a scripture and it said I'm already a Buddha, and it gave me hope. You know, you don't say to that person, oh, that's not a definitive teaching, right? You say, that's great, that gave you hope, right? And the same thing for us. If we're in a state where we're feeling hopeless and that teaching gives us hope, well, that's not the moment to analyze, is it? You know, Buddha nature does exist conventionally, but anyway, the point is that different teachings serve different functions for different people, but even for us, it may serve a different function at different moments. Does that make sense? Okay, so all those three turnings of the wheel of the Dharma then have a deep purposes to benefit students, to benefit us, to benefit practitioners. But now this particular teaching, right, is from the second wheel of the turning Dharma, and it's considered to be, you know, by our tradition, by the Tibetan tradition, it's considered to be a definitive or the definitive teaching of the Buddha. And so that's what we're studying, is the definitive meaning of the Buddha's teachings, the final meaning, in a sense. In a second, I want to turn to the title. I want to cover that, and then we'll move on. But I guess I want to pause there. Now, I know it may be tricky because I know there's a whole thing with the Zoom here, but do people have questions up to this point before I go on? I guess this way you can, if you click on like raise your hand or something, maybe Dondrup can unmute if there is somebody who has a question. Okay, we're good. What I'd like to do next is cover just that, you know, so in the sutra itself, right, we started with, and I want to cover this title. I don't want it to actually contemplate, not just cover it, but contemplate it together for a few minutes. So, and I want to use the Sanskrit title, which we read. It's in the actual version that this is by, many of you know that this translation is by Venerable, you know him, he's Venerable George Chertoff. He's taught at our center. He teaches all over the world. He's a wonderful monk and wonderful person who, he was a great student and teacher for many years. And then he recently finished, a couple of years ago, right? He finished a 3-year retreat down in North Carolina. Now he teaches, because he's not traveling at the moment, obviously, but a wonderful person. But anyway, so he translated this. But I wanted actually, so we'll use the Sanskrit title, Arya Bhagavati Prajna Paramita Hridaya Sutra, which is how it's said, right, from people all over the Buddhist world. They recite that part in Sanskrit, or different pronunciations probably. And I kind of want to talk about not the meaning of those words, but also to contemplate them together. And so let's start with Arya, right? That's the first part of that title. And even just that word actually is very profound, I think, to contemplate, right? Arya. So some of you know, right, that like the word Arya, it's often translated as noble, right? Sometimes it's translated as transcendent. So it's translated different ways, but I just want to contemplate it for a moment together, because actually just that word, Arya, and actually I was pausing to think about this. I've studied the Heart Sutra quite a few times. I mean, I've read a lot of commentaries on it, but I was thinking back, I first studied this sutra actually as an undergraduate at Wesleyan University with a professor who had studied Zen Buddhism. Jim Stone was his name. Later, I studied it with the Dalai Lama and Lama Zopa Rinpoche and Gyume Khyentse Rinpoche and also Geshe Silgo. But I was thinking back to Professor Stone, actually, where I was very young when I met him. And he made a point, actually, when we were studying this, that I was thinking about as I was reading this. And he was pointing out, which I think was clearly correct, and you can actually see it in Buddhist scriptures, that Arya, just that phrase, is an incredible teaching of the Buddha. Like, has huge implications. And what I want to say, why? Like, that was a very loaded, powerful term in ancient India, this phrase, this word, Arya, right? Because Arya in ancient India was associated with the caste system, right? And the caste system is the foundation, in many ways, and was the foundation, still is, in some ways, in some parts of India, or in some way, I believe, still plays a big role in India, but at that time it was humongously important, right? So Arya meant you were of the higher caste, right? Traditionally, I mean, at that time. And there's a sutra that Professor Stone actually shared. I remember this when I was in my 20s, where in the sutra, these two young men come to see the Buddha, two young Indian men. Buddha was Indian too. I guess he was technically born in Nepal. It's now Nepal, but it was India then. And these two young men come and they say to him, kind of, we're important and you should teach us and explain things to us, and we're Aryas. What they meant was that they were high caste people in Indian society, right? And then the Buddha said to them, essentially, I don't remember the exact wording right now, but basically he said, you're not Aryas. He said, and then he reinterpreted the meaning of the word Arya, right? Because there, in that sense, what did Arya mean in ancient India? It meant so it was socioeconomic, actually, right? It meant you had high social standing and you had more access to wealth and resources than other people, right? And it was like the opposite extreme would be the untouchables, right? The untouchables were the opposite of an Arya in that socio-political context, right? And so when they said we're Aryas, they meant, we're important people. We have high social standing. We have wealth. We come from good families, from wealthy families, from families that have some influence and power, right? And basically what the Buddha's response was that's not the meaning of noble. That has nothing to do with being noble. And then he reinterpreted. He said, a noble being is someone who has seen reality directly. And if you've not seen reality directly, the ultimate nature of reality directly, then you're ignorant. And ignorant people aren't noble. Now you can imagine those two young men didn't like hearing that. That wasn't what they were expecting to hear from the Buddha. And you remember earlier today I said becoming wise means sometimes moving out of your comfort zone, right? So the Buddha was pushing them out of their comfort zone, wasn't he? By reinterpreting that word that had incredible power in their culture, right? And so the Buddha then, as part of his whole tradition, actually, that's where, first of all, he was very radical in a number of ways. One is, by creating a monastic system that accepted people of any caste, he undercut the caste system. And then he reinterpreted this word of Aryas, right? Where he said, so he basically, so my point. So, because ordinarily, right, people of the Brahmins would be considered Aryas, and then what they're called Kshatriyas, which they sometimes translate like warriors, or maybe you could call them politically powerful caste. Like they were warriors, but they were also sort of they would be, kings would be Kshatriyas, and also like advisors to kings, things like that, ministers, and right. And so he was saying, no, those aren't Arya. Aryas are people who've seen reality directly. And so this word Arya means you've seen emptiness, which is the topic of this whole sutra, right? And so just that word has that meaning. And now I want to say just a reflection about this is, as we listen to that, as most of people here live, we all are living in the West, right? And from the West. And we could sort of subtly feel superior in one way, like saying, well, we're not from a caste system. Actually, because I remember when I first heard about the caste system, that was what I thought. I thought, oh, well, the Buddha was awesome, I thought, but those, I remember when I was in my 20 something, and I was 20, I don't know, I first heard this point, and I thought, well, the Buddha was quite wonderful, but oh, those poor Indians, they lived under a caste system. But actually, and what I didn't think about at the time enough was, well, so do we. We don't use the word Arya, and we're a little, but so the point I want to make is like, what does our culture think of as noble? Right, we don't use that word, but as what word would we use? I don't know. Good, cool, wonderful. Actually, I guess we use the words rich and famous, right? Or good looking, or something like. Right, and actually, our criteria are, if you think about it deeply, like our criteria, it was like, I guess what I'm getting is like, what do kids grow up wishing they were like, right? And then my point here is that this word Arya has an implication for us, right? Like, because would the Buddha think that's worth being? No. What most kids grow up thinking is really great, the Buddha would say to them just what he said, the same kind of thing he said to those wealthy young Indian men, right? Because the Buddha is saying what's noble is reality, right? What's noble is spiritual endeavor that leads you to direct perception of reality, right? And that has nothing, that's actually, in any cultural context, that's radical, isn't it? Like nobody, who thinks that, right? Like who thinks that? Somebody who's gained insight through meditation into the ultimate nature of reality, that's noble. That's wonderful. That's what's to be aspired to, right? But to aspire to anything less is beneath us, is actually the idea, right? So to aspire to power, to aspire to wealth, to aspire to prestige, to aspire to, is beneath you, is what I'm suggesting are all implied in that word Arya. Because right here, that's what he's saying. What's Arya? Arya Bhagavati Prajna Paramita Hridaya Sutra. He's saying, what's noble? It's the Bhagavati Prajna Paramita, which we're going to get to in a second, what that means, right? But what he's saying is, that's what you should aspire to, right? And so we have to ask ourselves, like, what do I aspire to, right? And even if we think, it's quite subtle, isn't it? Like, because even when I said that, like when I said the thing, like when I was in my 20s and I heard the, Indian caste system, I thought, oh, well, our culture is more enlightened than that. I didn't really understand, not so much, right? Like, if you think of, well, yeah, I mean, if I think of, I'm going to make, I don't want to go too far into politics right now, but I'll just say one point, like it just struck me very viscerally, like, because of, I don't feel nervous to go for a jog in my neighborhood. And I haven't heard from a black man who does, who doesn't feel, I haven't heard a black man yet tell me they're not nervous to go for a run. So do we have a caste system? Maybe so, my point is that, based on race, based on privilege, based on, also based on economics right now. And if you see the, who's able to work from home and who isn't during a pandemic, who has to put their lives at risk, and the death rates based on socioeconomics and race, it's horrifying, actually. So I don't know. So one point I'm making is I'm not so sure we're better than the ancient Indian tradition, maybe worse. But then also think about what we have to ask ourselves, what do I aspire to? Right? Moment to moment. And is it wisdom? And if you're honest, if we're honest with ourselves, maybe sometimes, but not always, is it? Oftentimes we aspire to other things. And the Buddha, I think here, I just want to point this out, and then I'll move on to the next clause, next word. But I think the Buddha is not trying to criticize you in using this word Arya. I think he's trying to say it's beneath you, like that you have a precious human rebirth. You're an amazing spiritual being with infinite potential to become a Buddha. And for you to give your energy to something less than wisdom is like, what's the word? You deserve better. It would be like, yeah, you deserve better than that. You're capable of more than that. You're capable of being someone who sees reality, of actually being a spiritually noble being, a transcendent being. And so I think this first word, to me, it implies that. It implies that the Buddha is saying, please be an Arya. You're capable of being an Arya. You in particular, because you have a precious human rebirth, right? If we won't go into detail, but which has 8 freedoms and 10 endowments as taught in the Lam Rim tradition. So use that. Become wise. Anyway, so that's, I kind of went off on a long tangent about just the first phrase. But so then next we'll talk about, so Arya, right? Then Bhagavati. So, and you'll see next in the sutra itself, here it says Bhagavati, and then later it says the Bhagavan, right? And so those are obviously they're the same root word. But Bhagavan is the male version of that. In Sanskrit, words, have a different, as happens in many languages, right? Spanish is similar. Words can, have a different, change slightly depending on the gender, right? So Bhagavan is the male and Bhagavati is the female version of the same word. So here it's Bhagavati is referring to a female, right? And they can translate, oftentimes in English they'll say, if they, like Venerable George just left that is Bhagavan and Bhagavati. Oftentimes when they make that into English, they'll sometimes translate it as the, what's it called? The Blessed One. Or in this case, sometimes they'll translate Bhagavati as Blessed Mother or Blessed Woman. But I think it's worth contemplating the meaning of Bhagavati now. And again, like these little, it's just a word, right? Or often it's just a word, but it has incredible meaning, just that Bhagavati, to think about. And so let's go through it bit by bit. So the first part of that word is Bhaga, right? For Bhagavati, Bhaga. And Bhaga means, there are different ways to interpret the meaning, but in the context of the Heart Sutra and the commentaries and the ancient, actually I've been looking at the Indian commentaries and they agree on this point. So Bhaga can mean to overcome or to destroy. So it's the woman who overcomes in the first part, right? The female who destroys. And what does it mean? What does she overcome? Or what does it overcome? The Bhaga. What it means to overcome something, or Bhagavan is the the Buddha overcame something then. And all the commentaries agree what it means is to overcome the 4 maras, is the meaning. And what are maras? You know, so it's, I like that, again, that's, yeah, we have time. So 4 maras. So they, you know, do you remember, like, you've heard the story, the life story of the Buddha, right? You know, that beautiful story, right? Where the Buddha sat under the Bodhi tree, right? That night, right? The Buddha, you heard the story, right? The Buddha had been fasting, and then he decided that extreme asceticism was not the path to enlightenment, right? And he accepted like rice milk from a maiden beside, you know, there in Bodh Gaya. And then he, after eating, you know, that, he sat beneath the tree, the Bodhi tree, the tree of enlightenment. And they say, he said, I will not rise from this seat until I become enlightened. And then they say throughout the night, right, Mara came, right? That's the story, right? Mara came with his tempting daughters and his demon army to try to obstruct the Buddha from becoming enlightened. Right? So sometimes Mara, like Maras, right, is translated like demons, devils, something like that. Right? Like a, yeah, demon. This way they usually translate it, right? So here we talk about 4 maras. And what's interesting is, like, so these are like the 4 demons of human experience. So the first of the 4, this is interesting though, right? Because we're saying, like, what do we want to overcome, right? What did the Buddha overcome? What is Prajnaparamita overcome? And what do we need to overcome is the point here, right? So the first Mara, that Bhaga means overcame, is the Mara, or the demon of the afflictive emotions, right? And that's fascinating in and of itself, isn't it? So in other words, because as soon as you say demon, you tend to think of something outside yourself, right? But the first of our major demons that we have to overcome to become enlightened is our own mental afflictions, right? So what does that mean? It means our anger, our hatred, our craving, our desire, our ignorance, our pride, our jealousy, our, all those, right? And so on. So we have to overcome those maras. And how do you overcome them? Through wisdom, right? That's the implication here. Wisdom is what overcomes the mental afflictions. And part of that, actually, Aryadeva says, right, in his 400 stanzas on the Middle Way, which is a commentary on Nagarjuna's commentary to the Prajnaparamita Sutras, right? He makes a point where it's mentioned in the Middle Length Lamrim, where he says, all the different mental afflictions are kind of pervaded by ignorance. That ignorance is where they arise from ignorance, and ignorance undergirds them and pervades them. And so if you overcome and destroy ignorance, then you overcome and destroy all the mental afflictions. And so that's why also sometimes, they depict Manjushri holding a sword, right? The Bodhisattva of wisdom. They depict him holding a sword in the sense that he slays. What does he slay, right? In Buddhism, you're not using a sword to hurt other people ever, right? That wouldn't be the symbolism. It's to overcome ignorance, right? Which then overcomes the mental afflictions. So that's the first of the 4 maras. The second of the 4 maras is the aggregates. Now that's kind of interesting, isn't it? Because again, we want to think of Mara. If you say demon, we want to think of something. Like, if you say the word demon to me, I'd rather think of I would actually try to think of somebody else, right? But the aggregates are our being, right? The aggregates are that upon which the I self is labeled, right? What's the aggregate? The aggregates are your body and mind, my body and mind, right? So how are those a demon, right? How are those a Mara? And what this is getting at is that where do they come from, right? Actually, in the teaching on the 3 types of suffering, right? There's the gross suffering, which is the suffering like a headache or pain. There's the suffering of impermanence or change, right? That wherever we find pleasure, if you keep doing it, you discover it doesn't remain pleasurable, right? But the third kind of suffering is the most important, which is the suffering of the compounded aggregates. That's what this is getting at. The third type of suffering, the suffering of the compounded aggregates. And what that means is, right, that our aggregates are samsara, that they come from ignorance. Right? And actually, it's taught in the 12 links of dependent origination, right? In other words, through ignorance, you create karma, right? Ignorance gives rise to mental afflictions. Through mental afflictions, you create karmic actions. And then at the time of death, you're terrified of, what's the word, of annihilation through death. And so you grasp, right? And that grasping activates your karma and throws you to another rebirth without any control. And according to Buddhism, you have no control. Ordinary people, we have no control. Bodhisattvas do, but ordinary people have no control over where they'll take rebirth and how, right? We're thrown by our ignorance, our mental afflictions, and our karma from rebirth to rebirth to rebirth. And so from a Buddhist perspective, these aggregates are conditioned by, or thrown by, or created by ignorance, other mental afflictions, and karma. And so they're samsaric, right? And our body is samsara, our mind is samsara. You know, I sometimes say that, like, well, teachings sometimes say that. Like, we want to think of samsara as a place. Like, sometimes people say that, oh, I'm in the Washington, D.C. area, I'm in samsara, I want to go to Colorado, then it'd be nirvana or something, or whatever, I don't know, whatever that would be, Tibet or Nepal or someplace, right? But, you know, what's that saying? Wherever you go, there you are. You know, in other words, if you have samsaric aggregates, then wherever those aggregates are, samsara is. And actually, like, you know, I sometimes think of that. Like, one time, somebody told me the story. They were with Lama Zopa at Kopan Monastery in Nepal. You know, and like, I've been to Kopan. Like, it was like, you know, Kopan's quite wonderful, but it's also, you know, like, I think at the time I had just gotten over having like stomach ailment from eating the food that had, you know, I wasn't used to, and it didn't seem like nirvana to me at the time. It was hard conditions a little bit. And then at that, it was back a long time ago. And then, but the story I heard was, somebody told me the story at the time, that he had pointed to Geshe Lama Kunchok, who was a great yogi. And he said, see him? And the person said, yeah. And he said, right now he's in Vajrayogini's Pure Land. Just walking, that for him, walking around Kopan was Vajrayogini's Pure Land. In other words, he was in nirvana, because nirvana is not a place. That's the point, right? He didn't have ignorance or mental afflictions. So for him, wherever he went, actually anywhere he would have gone would have been a pure land. Anyway, so the point is, the Mara of the aggregates is having aggregates that are created by karma and mental afflictions due to ignorance. And so through wisdom, we stop that process and we overcome that Mara, right? And then we gain, instead of having the 5 contaminated aggregates, we call them, right? It means aggregates contaminated by ignorance and mental afflictions, you gain Buddha's 3 kayas, or you gain the 5 wisdoms of a Buddha, you know, an enlightened existence. Does that make sense? Then you don't have that Mara. And then the third of the 4 Maras is death, right? And they don't mean like, they mean actual death, you know, dying, right? Dying and being reborn, and dying and being reborn. Right? That's the third of the 4 Maras. And again, you know, a Buddha or somebody who's achieved enlightenment overcomes death, right? How? Through wisdom. And then the last of those 4 Maras, there are different translations. Sometimes, or different views, I guess. Sometimes they call it desire, which for me, that would come under the mental affliction. So I'm not sure there'd be anything added if you just say desire. So I'm not sure that's meaning. For me, that I can't quite understand the meaning of that if you call it just desire. But usually, like the way Gyume Khyentse Rinpoche taught it was, the last of them is the being, an external being. Sometimes they translate divine son, like, or yeah, a divine son, or a divine being, but an obstructive one. And that's, they say, the being who actually obstructed the Buddha on the night of his enlightenment, who tried to obstruct the Buddha on the night of his enlightenment. You know, so it's sort of saying that it's also, there can be external obstacles to our enlightenment, right? And again, so the Buddha had those external appearances. And actually, it was very interesting, isn't it? So that when the Buddha was attacked, what did he do? You guys know that story, right? They say, first of all, he meditated on love, right? And when he meditated on love, right, then the arrows, right, they said like the arrows of the Mara's army were coming towards him. And when it entered the halo of his love, the arrows turned into flower petals and landed at his feet. So in other words, the Buddhist method for dealing with attack is love. From the time that was on the Buddha's night of achieving enlightenment, that was what he did, right? So the Buddha, that is saying, how should we deal with attacks? Love. And then and then they say that Mara himself, after his armies did that, right, then Mara himself came and said, you have no right to achieve enlightenment, which is actually like it would be an attack on the Buddha's self-esteem, maybe. Say you don't have the right. And what did the Buddha do, right? There's that thing that he touched the earth, right? And Mother Earth herself, right, arose, right? The earth goddess, the goddess of the earth, arose and said, I bear witness. This being, Shakyamuni, has practiced compassion. He's practiced love, lifetime after lifetime. I bear witness he has the right to achieve enlightenment. And then Mara had to back down. It's quite touching, I think, that story. That the Buddha, I just want to point something out also, like, because I think, also it's an important point in our time, I think, like, and it's going to imply part of this phrase, but do you notice how much the feminine is there in that story? I mean, the Buddha was a male person, right? But he it was a village girl who gave him the rice milk. It was the Mother Earth who stood up and witnessed his love and compassion and sacrifice and wisdom. And then we'll get to Prajnaparamita herself is depicted as a woman, but a female, feminine being. But anyway, so in that way, through love and wisdom, one overcomes the external obstacle. That's what we could say also, right? So there are four maras, right? The mental afflictions, the samsaric aggregates, death, and the external beings who obstruct. So in one sense, you could say a Bhagavan or a Bhagavati is someone who has overcome those four maras. In another way, you could say it's through this Bhagavati Prajnaparamita Sutra that you yourself will overcome. Does that make sense? So there are two ways you could interpret that. One is, Prajnaparamita, if you would think of her as a goddess, she overcame them, right? As a female Buddha, she overcame those four maras. Another way of looking at it or thinking about it is you yourself, through practicing this, will overcome those four maras. And both are, you can think of it either way in a sense. So that's the implication of the Bhagga, right? But then there's the Va, right, or Vat. That is said to mean, bring this up, endowed with fortune, or so it means endowed with, or having qualities, something like that. And these, I'm not sure how much detail they go into, but I'll mention it, because a couple of commentaries say, so, and what, actually I'll say first, in general, like, the Bhagavati, or Bhagavan, is endowed with all good qualities, right? So that's one way of saying that, is that they've overcome all the obstacles and they've achieved all the good qualities. That's one way of putting it. In particular, the commentaries mention Vat implies being endowed with 6 fortunes. So the fortunes of 6 qualities or 6 good things, which are lordship, naturally good qualities, fame, glory, effort, and wisdom. And those each have different meanings. Like, for example, like fame in this context doesn't mean ordinary fame. It means having the rupakaya of a Buddha, the form body of a Buddha. Wisdom in this context means having the wisdom body of a Buddha. Lordship means that the Buddhas outshine or their compassion and their love outshines that of all other beings, even the gods. Glory, implies they have the wisdom that sees how all things are equally empty. Effort, the quality of effort implies that they work continuously for all sentient beings out of compassion and so on. So those are, what they're getting at really is that, so vat means having qualities of an enlightened being. And I'll make one other point, right? So this phrase, bhagavati, so one is destroyed what needs to be destroyed, and the other has achieved what needs to be achieved, or is endowed with what needs to be endowed with. And that's similar to the meaning of sangye, which is the Tibetan word for Buddha. Because a Buddha, is same meaning, they're synonyms, right? Because in sangye is similar. Sang means overcame all obstacles, and ge means achieved all good qualities. Right? And actually, I was just looking this week because I was preparing for this. I'd always wondered this because that's the Tibetan word, sangye. And then I thought, oh, but Bodhi doesn't have, the two syllables of Bodhi don't have that same implication. So I was looking at Lama Tsongkhapa in his commentary on the Prajnaparamita Sutras. He explained, I knew that was the meaning of sangye, right, the Tibetan word for Buddha. But then I was looking at, he explains how that comes from the word Buddha, the Sanskrit word Buddha. And he says, ordinarily we say Bud, right, means awake, right, an awakened being. And he says, awake means awakened from the slumber of ignorance, right? That's the meaning of, that's one way to interpret the word Buddha, is one who is awakened from the slumber of ignorance. And so in that sense, they've overcome unconsciousness. They've overcome ignorance, right? So they've, like Sang, they've overcome the obstacles. But then he says there's another implication of the word Buddha in Sanskrit, which I hadn't heard before, in this way. And he says, and actually he doesn't, well, he's not speaking in English, but it's that he was writing in Tibetan. But it's the root, same root as bud, like a bud of a lotus flower. And he says, because you ordinarily if you hear the word Buddha translated, they'll say the awakened one, right? Because that's the usual way to interpret Bud means to awaken. Buddha is an awakened one. But then Lama Tsongkhapa points out another implication in Sanskrit of Bud is it's the similar. So he says it's like the lotus flower that opens. So like bud, a bud of a flower that opens. And that means opened out all the good qualities. Does that make sense? So even the word Buddha has the same implication as Bhagavati and as Sangye and so on. So, okay, so Bhagavati then has a very deep meaning, doesn't it? Overcame the four maras and achieved all the good qualities of an enlightened being, wisdom and compassion in particular. And then, as I said earlier, that it ends in E, T, not Bhagavan, but Bhagavati is the feminine part of, feminine way, I don't know what word to use, the feminine way of phrasing that in Sanskrit. And so the Prajnaparamita is depicted as female. And there I want to pause for a moment and first I'll give a traditional interpretation and then sort of reflect on it together for a moment. Ordinarily, they talk in Tibetan, in Buddhism rather, in Indo-Tibetan Buddhism. And this applies in the Sutrayana, as is the case here, and also in Tantra. Method is usually depicted as male, and wisdom as female. And so, of course, the perfection of wisdom is female then. And there are various ways that's talked about. One is all the Buddhas are born of wisdom. So the wisdom is their mother. That's one way of talking about it. All enlightened beings, whether it's male or, and Buddha doesn't mean male, or Buddha could be male or female, right? All of them, like Tara is a female Buddha, right? So one way of talking about that is that all the Buddhas, whether they're male or female, are born of Prajnaparamita. And then another way of thinking about it that they sometimes talk about, and this is said in the sutra, as Buddha said this in a sutra, is he said, any being who's going to achieve liberation from samsara has to meet and be born of the Prajnaparamita, has to come from the Prajnaparamita. And so then he says, the Buddha says, so there are different types of enlightenment that different beings achieve, right? Like there are Shravakas, or hearers, who achieve arhatship, their own liberation. There are Pratyeka Buddhas, who achieve their own liberation, but in a higher sort of, with more merit. There are Bodhisattvas, right, who are on their way to Buddhahood, but are not yet Buddhas, and then there are Buddhas. And they all come from Prajnaparamita, from wisdom. And then he says, but they apply different methods, right? So in one sense, the mother is common to all. But you can say the father, the method is different, right? So like for example, for a arhat, the method was renunciation for themselves. For a bodhisattva, the method is love and compassion for all sentient beings and bodhicitta, right? So depending upon which method or which motivation you carry with you when you, or you're influenced by, maybe is the way to say it, when you are born of Prajnaparamita, will determine which kind of enlightenment you achieve. So that's another way of thinking about it. And then that's the traditional explanation. Now I just want to share a couple of, these are like more my own personal reflections for just a moment. I think it's also significant, right, that like to think about this, like I just want to point out, like, because most of us here come from a culture, or cultures maybe, where the divine is not usually depicted as female. And here it's depicted as female. So that's significant. And now I just want to briefly share, I can do it, I think. Here's an image of Prajnaparamita. Okay, I don't know if you can see that, and then I'll stop the share now. Okay. That's just one. There are various different depictions of the goddess Prajnaparamita, but it's significant in some ways, I think. And I was actually thinking about this. I'll share now. I'm going to go back to that book about Serra Monastery. It's a book by Jose Cabezon, and something struck me. Like, it was just like, how does it affect a person, right? Like, there is on the one hand, if you grow up in a culture where the divine is always depicted as male, how does that affect you? And then I want to point out, like, even monks, right? So if you think of Serra Monastery, it was all guys at a monastery, right? The nunneries are all female and monasteries are all guys. But if you were at Serra Monastery and you were a monk, I'll just share this. Like when they did their daily prayers, right? Before their classes and debates and so on. The first prayer they did was an invitation to goddess Tara. Second prayer they did was to 11 times, and if you've ever done the 21 praises to Tara, right? Many of you have done that. It's a nice practice. It's not short. It's a few pages long. They would do that 11 times, the 21 praises to Tara. Then they would recite respect for the goddess of Tara, or praise to Tara, or respect for Tara. Then they would recite the 7-limb prayer, right? The 7 limbs to Tara. Then they would recite a prayer called Abandoning the Faults of the Body, a praise to Tara's body, speech, and mind. Then they would recite, as I mentioned earlier, the Heart Sutra 9 times, right? Addressed to the Prajnaparamita, right? The noble lady. Then they would recite the Dharini, meaning like the mantra, to the lion-faced Dakini, who's a wrathful deity, a wrathful female Dakini, a female like skygoer, right? She was a goddess with the face of a lion, the body of a woman and the face of a lion who flies through the sky to remove obstacles. Fierce. Right? So they would recite her prayer. Then they would recite a prayer to remove obstacles and a dedication prayer. Then they would recite the mantra of Parnashavari, who's a leaf-wearing goddess. She's actually being done quite a bit now because she protects from diseases and epidemics and pandemics. So a lot of people are doing her practice these days. She's like a beautiful goddess who wears all clothing of leaves and dwells in the forest and removes illnesses, obstacles, pandemics, and epidemics. And then they would do various other prayers, but the first what, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, of the first 10 prayers they would do in the morning, right? One is a dedication of merit and a recitation of obstacles, which is not addressed to anybody. So all the ones that are addressed to somebody are addressed to goddesses. That's interesting, isn't it? So I'm just sharing that to think about what are the implications of that. How does that change your perception and perspective? And that, if we're practicing in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, then there's a big emphasis on the feminine. And that's quite true in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. I'm not suggesting that Tibetan Buddhism's always been perfect in its relation to gender, but in this issue, I think that's important. And in particular, that the Buddha, right, emphasized that the Prajnaparamita, the source of all enlightenment, the source of all enlightened qualities, the source of liberation is feminine. That was the Buddha's point. Not, he said that, not somebody else. And I wanted to just share one other point. This is just I always want to be clear, like when I'm saying, most of what I'm saying comes from the traditional commentaries, but this, what I always try to be clear if I'm saying a couple of my own reflections. So I did one, and I'm gonna do one more reflection of my own, then I'll switch back. I was actually thinking about this just myself, like that oftentimes, and actually I was thinking about this in the West, like our artwork, I was thinking of if you look at, these days you can't go to a museum, but if you would go to museums, right, or look online or things like that, right? I used to think of I used to like the paintings of El Greco, and he would always have saints going like this, or like this, looking up, right, to God in the sky, and God was a guy up there, right? And that's true in a lot of Western art, isn't it? And a lot of Western literature, right? And even in the West, that's the gesture, right, is often like this, looking up. But one point, as you'll see as we go through this text, and this is consistent with what the teaching is saying, this teaching will say, is Prajnaparamita, the great wisdom, isn't only up there. Right? Prajnaparamita pervades all phenomena. Right? Prajnaparamita, in the sense, if Prajnaparamita is the wisdom understand, if Prajnaparamita, I'll get into a minute what Prajnaparamita is, but emptiness pervades all phenomena. Let's leave it at that for now, right? So in one sense, if you think of, Prajnaparamita is wisdom itself, right, formless, but Prajnaparamita is, one of the lines in the sutra, right, form is emptiness, right? Also feeling, discrimination, compositional factors, consciousness. So in one sense, Prajnaparamita, in the sense of emptiness, pervades all phenomena. So anyway, that's worth reflecting on, I think. Even just if you were, because honestly, I think as Westerners, we could think that, oh, I'm praying to the Buddha up there. And now we do visualize sometimes the Buddha here, but actually in the Avatamsaka Sutra, right, even the Buddha himself is depicted as, there are thousands of Buddhas on every atom, right? Every atom of existence is filled with Buddhas. That's a vision also of this Mahayana Buddhism. That in one sense, every place is pervaded by Prajnaparamita, and every place is pervaded by Buddhas. Okay, hopefully, actually, I guess we'll just finish the title today, which is, because next word is Prajnaparamita. And, right, Arya, Bhagavati, and then Prajnaparamita. So, Prajna is wisdom. Yeah, deep wisdom or profound, profound wisdom, call it. Paramita means perfection, or gone beyond, or gone to the other shore. Transcendental wisdom, they sometimes call it. Perfection of wisdom, they sometimes call it. And I want to say something about Prajna. A traditional explanation is that there are 4 types of Prajnaparamita. And I'll go through them in the order they're usually explained in. One is the resultant Prajnaparamita, and that's the Dharmakaya of a Buddha. So that's the mind of a Buddha, right? That the mind of a Buddha is the Prajnaparamita, or is non-dual from Prajnaparamita. So the resultant Prajnaparamita is the mind of a Buddha, or the Dharmakaya, the Dharma body of the Buddha. Then there's the path Prajnaparamita. And the path Prajnaparamita is specifically the direct realization of emptiness under the influence of bodhicitta. So it only exists in the mental continua of Arya Bodhisattvas. So first of all, Bodhisattva means somebody who's achieved bodhicitta, effortless bodhicitta, right? That means, as we know, right, that effortlessly that person has unbearable compassion, right? They dedicate their entire being to the welfare of others. And they strive for enlightenment, for the welfare of others. And when such a person, through meditative absorption, directly realizes emptiness, that experience of, and they sometimes say, their experience, that experience of emptiness is direct, unmediated, naked, totally unmitigated, with no conceptuality at all, no subject-object dualism, like water poured into water. Right? So when that person, under the influence of their bodhicitta, directly realizes emptiness, that's Prajnaparamita. Actually, and you could say in one way, then they've actually met Prajnaparamita. If you're thinking of it as a goddess, that's the meaning of that. But it's and that's the actual path Prajnaparamita. And I'll make one other point. So if we meditate on Prajnaparamita, we don't actually, that's not actual Prajnaparamita, but it's the practice that we're practicing the Prajnaparamita, right? But we haven't yet achieved the path Prajnaparamita until you realize emptiness directly. Then the third type of Prajnaparamita is the scriptural Prajnaparamita. So those are the texts, the books of this genre. And so the Heart Sutra would be one of them. And I'll make a brief comment. There are many, they sometimes say they're in Tibetan, I think they list 17 maybe. So there's the large sutra, or the great sutra on Prajnaparamita, which has 100,000 stanzas. And that's been a version of that was translated into English by Edward Kanza. It's a big blue book like this, quite long. Then there's like the middling length Prajnaparamita, which is 25,000 stanzas. I can't remember if that's in English or not. Like probably is, but I can't remember where it's published. And then there's the short Prajnaparamita, which is 8,000 verses, and that also is Edward Kanza translated that also. It's a smaller book. 8,000 verse Prajnaparamita. And then, but there are about 17 different other lengths. There's one in 300 verses. And then the Heart Sutra that we're studying is the 25 verse. That's considered to be 25 verses in length. The shortest Prajnaparamita, actually, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, when he taught, one time when I was, some of you were there probably too, when he taught the Heart Sutra, then he taught it, then he said the shortest of all the Prajnaparamitas is one syllable. Ah. And actually it's funny, it says, a disciple of the highest caliber, or the highest merit, highest wisdom, when the Buddha would just say, ah, they would realize everything that's taught in the 100,000 verse Prajnaparamita. So anyway, when His Holiness said, ah, I didn't have that experience. Maybe hopefully some of you guys have that merit to have, like, just to hear the word simple syllable ah And then you could realize the entire meaning of the Prajnaparamita. So anyway, so they're all different length scriptures, but all those scriptures are the Prajnaparamita. And we respect those scriptures as teaching how one goes about realizing the path Mahamudra in order to achieve then the resultant Mahamudra. And then the fourth of the four types of Prajnaparamita is what they call the natural Prajnaparamita. And that refers to the emptiness of all phenomena, which is always present, right? It's natural in the sense that it's their nature. And it's, what's the word? You know, it's always there. It pervades all existent phenomena. You know, so the natural Prajnaparamita is primordial emptiness or natural emptiness. The emptiness that's uncreated, that's always present, you know, and so on. So when we say, right, and so in one, so and you get the idea here. So Arya Bhagavati Prajnaparamita, right, the noble you know, Holy Mother, you could tell her, Bhagavati, and then Prajnaparamita, right? So you get the idea. So ultimately, Prajnaparamita is has no form, right? But then I showed we can depict. She's sometimes depicted, and actually, you know, sometimes we could say the Prajna. All the Buddha's forms are expressions of the Prajnaparamita. Male Buddhas, female Buddhas, in one sense, because they're all born of Prajnaparamita. But so that's the meaning of Prajnaparamita. Then Hridaya, right? So Hridaya means heart. So when we say Heart Sutra, the Heart of Perfection of Wisdom Sutra, or Heart Sutra, that's the Hridaya. And I've seen in the commentaries two different ways of interpreting heart here. One way is that, you know, there are all these long, extensive scriptures, right? 100,000 verses and the 25,000 and 8,000. But in one way, you could say this brief sutra contains the heart meaning of all those others. And all the commentaries say that. This sutra contains the meaning of all those longer sutras. So that's one way of saying heart. It's the heart of the Prajnaparamita. It contains all the essential meanings. It's the essentialized. It's the essence. That's one way they put it. And then another way of meaning that one commentary mentioned, which I thought was interesting, was that another thing is that heart, you know, that the heart is the kind of the center of our body. It's needed for life, in a sense. But you know that emptiness is the heart teaching. You know, and that emptiness is the essence in a way. It teaches emptiness, and emptiness is that essence. And then sutra, right? So sutra means a teaching from the Buddha, historical Buddha, Shakyamuni, in the Buddhist tradition. You know, if it's a Buddhist sutra, then it has to be, and actually it's an interesting point though, because it's like, you'll see as we go along that most of this sutra is not spoken by the Buddha. It actually says in the sutra itself, it's spoken inspired by, you know, Shariputra asks a question and Avalokiteshvara answers the question, right? When I read the sutra, you heard that. And only at the end, the Buddha says, you know, agrees, you know, sort of praises Avalokiteshvara. But it says early on in the sutra, through the power of the Buddha, this conversation comes about. So there are various types of sutras, is my point. Some sutras are spoken by the Buddha, and other sutras happen through the inspiration of the Buddha. Through the Buddha is present and inspires that sutra. But in either case, it's a teaching from the, like, what's the word? From the time of the Buddha and in which the Buddha was present. Does that make sense? Otherwise, it's not. If it's not directly inspired by the Buddha himself, it's not a sutra. You know, so even the teachings of, say, Maitreya, like the Abhisamaya Alamkara, which is a commentary to the Prajnaparamita, that's considered a shastra, which means like a commentary. So I'm just pointing out, when we say sutra in Buddhism, it means, in the Buddhist tradition, it means a teaching from historical Shakyamuni Buddha. And so this is a teaching from Shakyamuni Buddha. Right, so it's that. It's a sutra from Shakyamuni Buddha, so a teaching, you could say, from Shakyamuni Buddha on that topic, right? The noble Bhagavati, the Prajnaparamita. And so that's like an overview of the meaning of the title. That's kind of fun. And again, I guess Dundrup said if people have questions, you can hit, I think what he recommended was people can hit their hand up symbol, and then he can unmute if people have a question, or they can type a question. Either way. But any questions there? Any questions about any of that? And Cynthia, let's see if Dundrup, if you can do it, or else I'll try to unmute. I can do it, I guess. Okay, Cynthia, you can talk.
Yeah, so I've got just clarification. So I missed the third, you said there are like three, what was that? 3 ways of interpreting. I think I missed the third one.
Three ways of interpreting Prajnaparamita, or 3 ways, or the 3 types of Dharma?
I think you said okay. 3 ways of interpreting heart.
Heart.
I heard it, and then I just need, like, the first type of paramita you said, Dharmakaya of a Buddha, and then at some point it said the Buddha. So I just wanted, sometimes I get confused when a Buddha is referred as a Buddha versus the Buddha. I have different, like when someone says a versus the, I have a different meaning in my mind. So I just want to get clarification. Is that different when I'm listening to teachings? Like, would I interpret that as the Buddha for me is Shakyamuni, whereas a Buddha is like more like just can be anybody. Like it's more like it can be me, it can be someone else. Those are my 2 questions. Thanks.
Okay, so the first question, I want to make sure I get it. I think you were asking, so of the 4 types of Prajnaparamita, I think is what you were getting at, right?
Yes, you said there were like 3 ways of interpreting heart. And then one was brief to say that it's the heart is really the essence of all the other teachings. The second was the emptiness is the.
Oh no, so sorry, heart. Maybe I said it wrong. Heart. There's only 2 actually. There were only 2, so you got them both.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah. And then the other point you raised, it should be all the Buddhas. So it's not. I mean, Shakyamuni Buddha is considered, the historical Buddha of our time. So that's correct. But in terms of, in the context of Prajnaparamita, they would say, because it's the Mahayana Buddhist tradition, and they would say, someday you yourself will be a Buddha, and that will happen because of the practice of the Prajnaparamita. And then like all the past Buddhas came from Prajnaparamita, all the present Buddhas, all the future Buddhas, anyone who achieves enlightenment comes from Prajnaparamita. So so does that answer that question? Yeah, so it would be, I mean, in this context, we're talking about Shakyamuni Buddha was the one present at the time of this teaching, but actually they say all the Buddhas teach the Prajnaparamita because it's the source of all the Buddhas.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay. And then did somebody else have a question?
Lauren, it's Lori here. I had my hand raised.
Oh, sure, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much. This has been wonderful. Very nice introduction to me. I'm new at Buddhism, but I'm trying to learn. And one of the things that you talked quite a bit about was the ultimate, maybe the nirvana, is this idea of emptiness, that if you can achieve true emptiness, you've kind of made it. And I just find that concept very troubling, that you want to be filled with things. You want to be filled with compassion and love and life and meaning. So the idea of getting to emptiness is just totally in conflict to that.
Oh, great question. Actually, I'll share. Lori's my cousin who I've known since I was a baby.
Born.
Since I was born, yeah. So, okay, good question, first of all. And in this context, the sutra, we'll go into that in detail as we go through the sutra, but in a brief way, I'll give a brief answer now, and then the sutra will cover it in much more detail. In this context, what the Buddha, in a way, means by emptiness, you could say that, what the Buddha means by emptiness is emptiness of independent existence. In other words, that we grasp at ourselves as existing in an independent way, separate from and apart from the world and from others, and we grasp at that, and then we sort of want to, either push away things that we don't like and grab towards everything that we personally want, And what this is getting at is that we're empty of existing in that way. So it doesn't mean we don't exist. What it means, or that we're empty in the sense of like nothingness or something. What it means is that you very specifically sort of identify the way in which we as ordinary people tend to grasp at ourselves as existing in some kind of independent, self-substantiated, separate way. And then you recognize I'm empty of that way of existing as an independent, separate, apart from others and the world. And so it's specifically empty of that, and that also that other things are empty of existing that way. Because sometimes we grasp at others as if, like if you really, the main problem is we grasp at ourselves that way. But we also grasp at others that way. So like, for example, if I don't like somebody, I sort of grasp at them as existing as like that, just that. And then I do like somebody and I grasp at them as existing like this. And it's this sort of grasping at a kind of independent, like, what's the word? As if things exist in the way that I grasp at them. And what this is getting at is that things are empty of existing in those wrong ways that we grasp at them. They actually exist, and this is the key point, is they exist interdependently. They exist dependently. And so emptiness doesn't mean non-existent or nothingness. What it means is empty of existing in an independent way because things are dependent or interdependent.
So it's almost like there's this huge neural network where everything is connected, but those links don't have any rules on them.
Say what you mean by rules. I'm not sure of that.
Like a link between two things, just naturally you think you have rules on it, distance or value. But if you can strip all those interconnections from any rules, then you're kind of at a point where everything is open.
In a way, you're right. Yeah, and I guess one thing I'll say though is like even one way they would say it, I guess, is that it's not that there are no rules, but even the rules are dependent. Like that even they are dependent upon causes and conditions and circumstances. And yeah, but that's right. So there's a kind of openness to emptiness. That's right.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Oh, sure. And then I think somebody else had a question too. Or Lynn, do you want to? You can unmute yourself apparently. Oh, or did you? Or I'll do it. Let's see. There. Sorry. Start again.
Yeah. I just have a question about language. How that phrase contains all these, how do you want to say it? All these multiple meanings. Is that because the language is structured that way, or is that sort of like poetry that that one word has multiple meanings packed into it? I mean, it just seems like a totally different language than ours, than English, or even a Romance language.
Yeah, it is. I think both are true. I think on the one hand, it like, if you study, I mean, I'm no expert on Sanskrit really, but if you study these, like the commentaries on many texts like this, one point is that Sanskrit really is like that, and the Buddha, and these teachings of the Buddha the Dalai Lama just last night, there was a teaching he gave live streamed. I was watching it, and he was pointing out, he was saying the Sanskrit, there's the Pali traditions. Some Buddhist scriptures were originally written down when they wrote them in Pali, and others were originally written down in Sanskrit. And it's only Dalai Lama was really praising highly the Sanskrit tradition as remarkable. He was pointing out like that the Sanskrit language has this quality, I guess, of etymologies and complex layered meanings. And then in a sense though, I mean, you say it right, like, yeah, no, so that is true of Sanskrit is one point. And then I guess also, it is a little like poetry though, isn't it too? Like in the sense of these layered meanings. But it's also, and I sometimes think about this, it's a very specific in a way, because like poetry in English, at least most poetry, and you can sort of, you can interpret it almost any way and there's no wrong interpretation. At least some people, I don't know, there might be wrong ones, but there are a limitless number of different possible right interpretations, maybe it's a better way to say it, on some poetry at least, not all. Sometimes there's a right and a wrong way to understand a poem, but in Sanskrit, in these Sanskrit texts like this, that originally come from Sanskrit, there are many layered levels of meaning, but they're also, I don't know, say, like, there's sort of a range of ways of interpreting it that are sort of correct. And then if one goes outside of those, I mean, that's one's own, it's okay for oneself, but it's not the correct, there's sort of, it's not as, it's open to various layers of meaning, but there's a range of correct layers of meaning, and then there are meanings that are not what was intended by the author, you could say. That's the right way to put it. So does that answer your question, though, or not?
Yeah, but there's a common understanding in the culture of
Yes.
what all those meanings mean.
Yeah. So that would, yes, exactly. That would be, there's a common, like, there's a common, like, this range of meanings. Like some people who would know all those layers of meaning, and some would know some of them. But yeah, I mean, like, the more learned a person is, or the more a person knows about those topics, the more layers would become evident to them. But yeah, no, that's right. Those layers and those. And actually, I'll just share. I mean, I've been reading some of the Tibetan commentaries to this, but I've particularly been reading the Indian commentaries in translation, and there are like 8 of them. And you really do get that sense that these various Indian authors, over the course of some of whom were from different centuries, that they each had their own, angles on the text, but there was overlap in terms of the understanding of the words. In terms of their own practice, they would then, add certain points about how you might practice this, but you could see that they all had a general understanding of the same basic meaning. Yeah. Anything else, or there's one or two other questions? Oh, okay. Let's see. Alex, you had a question. Oh, there. Unmuted. Okay, go ahead.
You talked about the meaning of the word Bhagavati or Bhagavan in the title of the sutra, and I'm wondering, is the meaning similar to the word Tathagata, which appears later in the sutra, or is it different?
Yeah, it's a little bit different in the sense that, of course, there's, in one way you could say they're synonyms in the sense that they both refer to an enlightened being, but they have a different connotation, or they get it, they're sort of, in one way they have a similar meaning in the sense that they're both sort of references to an enlightened person or being. But Tathagata, the meaning of Tathagata is like one thus gone, or one gone thus, you could say. Right, so a Tathagata has a particular connotation, which is the person who has traversed the path, in one sense, you could say. The similar quality is that, in one way, when you say Tathagata, it's interesting. There's a connotation, I think, in the Sanskrit, again, though, that the word thus, like when you say, if I said one gone thus, right, is how I just said it. In one way, you could take that to mean somebody who's gone along the path and has achieved the result of the path, enlightenment. But another way of understanding the word Tathagata, again, which is the word you asked about, is the thus can also mean reality. So it also can mean somebody who's gone to reality, or in a sense, and what that really means is who's sort of lost all the wrong projections about reality, and therefore is valid or sees what's true. So in that sense, there's a similar connotation, but you can get a sense of also a slightly different it has, ultimately it's both referring to the same kind of being, but there's a slightly different connotation in the word, if that makes sense.
So in the meaning of the Bhagavan, it specifically refers to a being that has overcome the 4 maras, but it's the same in the sense that the way that a being would overcome the 4 maras would be to have that understanding of the reality.
Exactly. Yep, that's correct.
Thank you.
Let's see. And then looks like Matt has Matthew Fritz. Matt, you should be able to ask your question. Matthew Fritz.
Okay.
Hey there.
Thanks, Lauren, for this talk. Just a quick question, follow up to the one before last. So I found it fascinating when you described the Bud in the Buddha as that we could create an analogy with bud. And I'm wondering if that is, you know, my history of language is not so great, but is that like, is it the actual same root, bud and bud, or is it like through a translation?
You know, I mean, the text where I found that was Lama Tsongkhapa's Golden Garland of Eloquence, which is it's a Tibetan text on the commenting on the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras. So he's not, you know, I mean, he was just pointing out that's an implication of the Sanskrit word bud, you know, the root bud. So he wasn't talking, of course, about common what's the word, common roots to English, because Tsongkhapa never studied English. But I guess my own reflection on that is that, you know, I mean, one thing I'm well aware is that Sanskrit, you know, is, you know, has common roots to English. And there are quite a few words in Sanskrit that have that share common roots with English, you know, and the idea seems to be, from my own, at least my own understanding of etymologies and sort of history of languages, the idea seems to be that there was an Indo-Aryan language, like a Proto-Indo-Aryan that you know, some of the Romance languages and some of you know, some English words and Sanskrit all sort of share a root in. So there are quite a few words in Sanskrit that share roots, and that's what, you know, if you read enough words in Sanskrit, you'll find there is a fair bit of overlap.
Interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, whereas Tibetan has no overlap at all.
Yeah. Right.
But Sanskrit does, because yeah, there seems to be a common, yeah, they call it the like, it's an unknown language that they call, that theorists call it, you know, Proto-Euro, European Aryan sort of language that seems to be that Sanskrit grew out of, and that it seems to also have, yeah, roots from English. English has roots in, rather.
Thank you.
Oh, sure. Let's see. I know we gotta stop in a minute. Any last question, or should we?
I do have a question before we leave.
Oh, sure.
So I was born and raised in a very macho culture. And I remember you mentioned that there's a big emphasis on the feminine and Buddhism. So that's something that I think I really need to be clear about, so I can just, like, you know, detach myself from that macho kind of culture that I was raised and born in. So if you can explain that.
Yeah, and I think part of the idea, at least, you know, again, I'm not trying to pretend that all of, you know, Buddhist history, you know, especially even Tibetan history, has been ideal. It's not, but you know, so I'm not trying to sort of idealize or something or exaggerate, but for sure it's true, actually, that that Buddhism, you know, that's why I gave that example of all these, I mean, even at the monasteries, much less at the nunneries, right, that there are all these praises to female enlightened beings, and that, you know, in Tibetan Buddhist tradition, you know, I mean, there's no practice that's done more than Tara practice. And Tara is the female, you know, it was often depicted as green because connected to nature, and is, you know, is described as just sort of a symbol or embodiment, a female embodiment of active compassion. And this idea, you know, anyway, so she embodies that quality. But I guess my point is that for sure, in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, there's a humongous emphasis on the importance of both male and female. And there's an emphasis in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition that, you know, at one point is also this really important emphasis that actual women and actual men have an equal ability to achieve enlightenment. That's one point. There's no difference. Actually, I guess Padmasambhava said, there's really no difference, but it's slightly easier for women. It was actually Padmasambhava's say, which I'm not sure why, but you know, could be a little easier. Maybe women have an easier time feeling compassion, or I'm not sure, but anyway, he said that. So one way, you know, on one level, it emphasizes this point that everyone has equal ability or potential for enlightenment. That's one thing. And then another, though, is, you know, I think it is important, though, because, you know, if you say that, but then just as my own opinion now, it's not, this isn't what, I mean, I don't think Buddhists, I've heard a Lama say this phrase, but, you know, I do think actually it's true. You know, actually just the other day I was reading something, you know, where, like, you know, how a culture depicts the divine affects people's sense of their own potential, I think. You know, and if you, you know, it like, I always think it's funny when, like, you know, cultures tend to do that, don't they? Like, I sometimes think it's funny, and you know, if you look at people from the Middle East, they look a certain way, but then if you look at European art, they depict God, they depict Jesus as looking European. And I don't think there are people in the Middle East who look like that, but, you know, obviously the historical Jesus lived in the Middle East. So, you know, how does that affect a person's sense of self is part of what I'm getting at. And so I think there is a significance for everybody, actually, for men and women, for the depiction of enlightened beings who are both male and female. In terms of, one is, I think, you know, I don't know, in terms of recognizing one's own potential and feeling that. But then another, again, this is just my own opinion, I'll share too on that, but I think it's reasonable. That's one point. So that's a couple points. One is everybody has a potential. Another is how you depict the divine is important in terms of people's sense of things. But also there's an emphasis in Buddhist practice on that we all need, like we all have, you know, I mean, this is my own reflection now, but the European psychiatrist Carl Jung talked about how, you know, masculine and feminine exist in all of us. They're archetypes. And in one sense also that we all need all those archetypes, you know, and if you only have depictions of male archetypes for the divine, that can be problematic, you know, for men and women both, you know, and I find, actually it's funny, I was noticing that this morning because I knew I was going to talk about this, and I was like, I don't get up super early, but I do. So usually I would be meditating from still through 10 o'clock, you know, through like from, you know, from early, before this class started for a while into the class. But I had to do short meditation this morning because I'll do more later. And I thought, well, which practice will I do? I only have time to do one practice. I was going to do a meditation before. And I did Tara. I did white Tara practice. That was the one I chose. You know, and there's something, I guess, and, you know, and I know Kensur, you know, like, I guess Kensur Rinpoche does white Tara. And I'll say in my own experience that doing meditations, it feels different. You know, I'll do a meditation on a male image of enlightenment and a female image of enlightenment every day. And I get something out of that myself, I know. Because they relate to different, different ways of being in my own body, different ways of feeling energy in my body, you feel something different emotionally, is my point. You know, and that's normal, isn't it? Because, like, the last thing I'll say, and I know we're going to stop, but, you know, because just if you say the word mother, like mother Prajnaparamita, that gives a certain feeling, right? And then, you know, I gave the example earlier of Manjushri, who's a male deity who holds a sword, right? And it feels different. You know, if you meditate on, they're both wisdom, right? Mother Prajnaparamita and Father Manjushri are two different, you know, images, right? But they feel different also, right? If I'm trying to meditate, I'm about to meditate on emptiness, but first I think of a male deity holding a sword, that gives a certain energy, right? Of cutting through. And then if I think of Prajnaparamita, and she's depicted with 4 arms, I showed that image of her, right? Which is like a mother, isn't it? Like mothers sometimes need a lot of arms, don't they? Feels like that. You know, because they multitask and they do all these things to take care of people, you know, and I guess all I'm saying is that they have different energies, and for everybody, I think that's really valuable. And so for me personally, I'm just sharing, I think there's something very valuable in sort of relating to, I think they allow all of us to relate to, relating to the divine in these different ways is, you know, allows us to find different parts of ourselves, I think, and to bring different parts of ourselves into our own spirituality. And I don't think Buddhism is the only tradition that does that. I mean, many traditions have those archetypes in different ways, and, you know, but that's a Buddhist way of doing it. I mean, that's part of the Buddhist way of doing that is, you know, so depicting wisdom as female and method as male, but also all these different images and archetypal images. You know, ultimately, Buddhism recognizes, ultimately, they're all formless in the sense of wisdom doesn't have a gender and doesn't have a form and doesn't have a color, but that there's a value. And I'll say one other thing, even relates to race, actually. I find this quite beautiful, that, and if you look at the Buddhist traditions, they also do that. Like, even though, you know, Tibetans are Tibetan, whatever, like if you look at the depictions of the gods and goddesses of Tibetan Buddhism, the images of, they're not really gods and goddesses, the images of deities, whatever you want to call them, they're green, they're blue, they're white, they're yellow, they're black, they're brown, they're every color, you know. I think that's wonderful. That's all I'm saying. Like, you know, because anyway, I think it's troubling if you only depict the divine as one race or one gender or one way, you know. So anyway, that's a few reflections. But we can talk about that more. And I guess our next class in this series is in, I think, 2 weeks, if I remember right. Not next week, but the week after. Yep. And then after that in June, we'll have 3, and I will just keep going with, I think, 3 classes a month roughly, unless some reason we can't, at least through the, you know, because during the pandemic, I think it's easy to do that. Probably, I think 4 we couldn't, well, usually we were doing 2, but I think we'll do 3 through as long as the pandemic's lasting, which seems like it's going to be quite a while. So I think the pandemic may last longer than these classes, unfortunately. But anyway, so I'll look forward to seeing everybody in 2 weeks. And thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lord.
Oh, and I guess we should dedicate the merit, right? The supreme jewel, bodhicitta, where it has not arisen, may it arise and grow. Where it has arisen, may it not decrease, but increase more and more. In the snowy mountain paradise, you, the source of good and happiness, all-powerful Chenrezig Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara ends. So you can dedicate however you like, you know, out of compassion for all beings to be well and safe and healed and so on. Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Lord.
Thank you, Lord.
Thank you, Lord.
Thank you.